actually related to German, and German doesn't get into the story here at all, unless they happen to be living in a German-speaking area, and then they also speak German. So Hebrew and Yiddish have no relationship genetically at all. Hebrew is a Semitic language. Yiddish is basically a European language. But Yiddish is the low language and the language of intimacy and family, and Hebrew is the high language. So you don't have to have the two languages be related. And Yiddish, however, was a language that didn't ever, and there's one more thing that complicates it. Okay, so is that clear so far? And then there's one more complication possible. Yes, did you?
Oh, I was just going to ask to clarify, so like the expanded definition is like the same thing as the old ones, that they don't have to be related.
Exactly.
They both have different like contexts.
Yes, yes. Now, but there's one more complication, and we need to know that for like when we're going to do Dominican Spanish or whatever, or Dominicans in the U.S. So in the case of Schweizerdeutsch, let me go back to that again, the low language is always only considered a dialect. It's not a literary language, it has no national status, there are no universities run in it, etc. So in many cases, the low language is low in this sense, socially. When you read Gall, you're going to see that those people, the peasants in that village, they speak Hungarian, but they speak a totally non-prestige level of Hungarian, so if they went to Budapest, everybody would laugh at them. And so their dialect, at least, there is a Hungarian language with a prestige over there, but what they're speaking is a non-prestige dialect, okay? But then, let's look at Nuyorican. So one of the articles, if I ever get to it, which is a fascinating article, is about Dominicans. Now, Dominicans, or other Hispanos, immigrants, live in a diglossic situation, as do all immigrants, at least in the first generation. So you speak at home your home language that your mother speaks. And most people don't go to school, unlike you, they don't go to school, they don't, in that other language, right? So they're often illiterate. For example, I know lots of Hungarians who spoke Hungarian at home, but because at home, and this would hold for Spanish and other languages, Hungarian you have the familiar address and the polite address, and at home they spoke always in the familiar. So this person goes to Hungary, or we could say goes to Spain or France, whatever the language they had, and they try to speak to people. They may have a native accent because they learned it as a kid, but they don't know how to address people properly because they don't know how to use the polite form. And so they insult people on the street because you can't go up to somebody and address them as you would address your brother or sister. So they learn the language incompletely. So for a Nuyorican, or take any other immigrant, but let's use that example, Spanish that they speak at home in this diglossic situation in New York or in an immigrant situation in North America becomes the low language. However, what is the complication here? It's not at all like Schweizerdeutsch because what's the difference between having a Nuyorican having Spanish as the low language and someone having Schweizerdeutsch as a low language?
There's no like high Spanish.
Well, that's the point. There is high Spanish. It's spoken everywhere else. It's just that the immigrant left that country where it's spoken, and his kids, who are in this new country, didn't learn completely that language, or even if he or she learned it, it didn't have any status in this new place, so it became reduced to a home language. So it becomes a home language. It has the role of Yiddish, okay? So Spanish in New York, in general, okay, I'm not talking about somebody's situation who got educated and became a professor in it. Of course you can do that because Spanish is there as a national language. It's used as a home language. The same thing for Hungarian. I know lots of people who speak Hungarian, but not properly. Not properly in that they couldn't get on this plane and go to Hungary. Even they might have a native accent, which is in fact very problematic. You get to that country, you have a native accent, but you can't behave properly with strangers because you only know intimate language. Okay? So, in other words, then there are, to complicate your original definition, you have three types of this, right? Of the high-low situation, where the low can be the same family, Schweizerdeutsch, is the example of that. Greek is another example of that. Haitian Creole is another example that that original article had. I can't now remember what the fourth one was. The second example is the expansion of that to examples like Hebrew and Yiddish, where the languages aren't related. But Yiddish is still a non-status language. There's no country that has Yiddish as its native language, right? So it still stays, or these Hungarians who speak only a dialect, a very hick dialect of Hungarian in relation to how a Budapest sophisticate would look at it. So it's a low language. Spanish is in a very different situation because Spain isn't that far. Latin America isn't that far. But yet people who come here as immigrants in that second generation, and the Dominican article, I really want to get to that because that's wonderfully shows you that, the use of Spanish in the Dominican community and what role it has. On one hand, it has a very useful role. On the other hand, it is definitely a low language. Okay, so is that more or less clear? And it doesn't have to be 100% clear, just more or less. And then tomorrow you can discuss it more if it's not 100%. But I'll take one question if anybody has any more questions. Any questions on it? No? Okay. Then, the question was, in Gal, I know some of it may be a little murky because of the geography, but who could tell us the answer? Who can show that he or she has read it to answer the central question? And of course, everything is about diglossic identities, right? Why do these, there's this little village, or now it's a town, but it was originally a village, that's in Austria, but it's near the Hungarian border. And if you know your history, you know after World War II, Hungary became a very small country. It used to be a big country because it was on the wrong side and it lost its territory. So this used to be a village in Hungary, and the more it has moved, so now it's a village in the middle of, not in the middle, near Hungary. And so it's an isolated little village speaking this peasant Hungarian with no contact with Hungary, because then after the Second World War, this already happened in 1920, it was cut off. But then after the Second World War, communism came to Hungary, and that would be the east and west divide of the Iron Curtain was there, right there next to them. So they could, even if they had a relative in Budapest, let's say, they wouldn't have find it that easy. So they were there isolated in this village doing hardscrabble farming. And what happened? The women didn't want to marry the local guys, okay? So why didn't the peasant girls want to marry the peasant guys? So now is your chance to show that you read the article. Because if you didn't read the article, you can't answer it. And if you read the article, even if you don't know the details, you should be able to answer that question. Yes?
So if women married a peasant man, she would have to work on the farm, and it's a lot of work for a woman, as opposed to marrying a worker, where she would have much less, she would have no farm work basically, she would have household appliances to help her because her husband would be making a wage. So they wanted to marry workers instead because it would be an easier, more luxuriant lifestyle.
And who were these workers they wanted to marry? You're absolutely right, I'm just asking more questions.
They did factory now.
No, what was their language or ethnicity or
Oh,
background?
they spoke German.
Yeah, they weren't Hungarian at all, yes.
Yeah.
And then how did the women manage to make the transition out of that village to find that nice Austrian guy to marry? Because they couldn't just leave the village and say, here's a good looking guy, I'm going to marry him, right? So how did they make, and besides they only spoke Hungarian when they were in the village. So how did they get there? You know, like people go to the big city from the farm and they go to New York, so how did they manage that? That's the linguistic part. Your answer is totally correct, but so far no language in it.
They would only speak German, the women.
But how did they speak German? They only spoke Hungarian in this village. Nobody spoke anything but Hungarian. They were all uneducated. The old ladies were even semi-literate. How did they learn to speak German? They had to have a transition, which was, very often, there are more opportunities for women, just like you see that in the immigrant classes here and these other articles. The Dominicans, the Laotians show that these immigrants, when nobody speaks the language, you know, like think about immigrants who come here. And what happens? The women end up going sewing in a factory or get some kind of job, and very often for the men, it's harder to get a job. So what happened there, in Austria, there is the Triumph brassiere and bathing suit company, which they don't sell in this country, I don't think, but it's a very big deal all over Europe. It's called Triumph. and there was a Triumph factory, an Austrian company, nearby. And so the women left the village and went to work for a wage in the Triumph factory, which allowed them to get involved to some degree in Austrian culture and to try to learn German. And they had to learn enough German first to try to catch a guy. Once they caught the guy, they left the village and they did all the things you said. But in addition, they wanted to absolutely change their identity. And if they had children with that guy, the Austrian guy, the children never spoke Hungarian because the mothers didn't even want them to speak Hungarian, because they were seeing that the Austrian German, although it was in the same place, for them was the high language, right? Even though for everybody else, all the Austrians, they only spoke Austrian. And it's complicated because there are dialects of that too. We won't get into that. But some version of German, any version of German, even a lower class version of German to them, was entry into that society. First the factory job, and then meeting these men and becoming Austrian. So that one of the old ladies says of one of these girls, and I'm putting it instead in Hungarian, it's in dialect there, says, looks at her and she says, oh, az már egész német. Német means German. She's like totally German already. What does that mean? It means she's changed her identity. She can speak German. She's on her way out. She's Germanized. So Német, when applied to somebody else, means they're German or German speaking. When applied to a girl in the village, oh, she's already, and it could be, she's Német, or it could be, she's Német, depending, right, how you're looking at that. But to be Német doesn't mean you're not from that Hungarian village. It means you've made that identity switch.
So it's like the Oreo.
The Oreo.
Yeah, the round one.
Oh, yes, in a way. Okay, so I think you need to finish this tomorrow because I want to go on to some of the others. But definitely look at some of these charts so that you get a chance to see what is the high. So they do not want to marry peasant men, and there's this wonderful here. So two Hungarian expressions. So one is egész német. Okay, so and the other one is the old lady says, because here's the title, peasant men can't get wives. And one of the old ladies, now remember the old ladies was the young women who are the most bilingual, and then the next step is they want to get out of there altogether. The people who are the least bilingual, who don't have any German at all, are the old ladies who, a generation before, they never left the village at all, where the men might have gone to the army or might have gone to sell stuff in another village. So the old ladies don't know any German, whereas the young girls do. And the mothers and the grandmothers advise their daughters not to marry the boy in the village. And so this old woman says, she works in the local bra factory. She's not going to shovel cow manure for the guy, or in Hungarian, ez a triumphba jár. Triumph, it doesn't say local bra factory, but says she goes to the Triumph every day, like that would be like Parliament or university or something, because that's how she says it. Not that she works. She goes to Triumph, okay? Az fog neki tehén szart lapálni, so she goes to Triumph every day. Az fog neki tehén szart lapálni, she's going to shovel cow shit. Okay, one last question, even if you didn't read it, see if you can figure it out. How come though, so that we can understand why the girls want to leave this, but the guys stay there? Why do the guys stay there? Why don't they also want to leave? What are they getting out of staying there? What do you think they could be getting out of it? Yes?
Could it have something to do with how, like, masculine coded languages have to do with, like, tradition?
That too, but there's even a more concrete, I'm sure it has to do with that too, masculine identity, and when we'll see in the other articles, like the Barcelona one, of the keeping themselves monolingual because what is called simplified masculinity, because becoming bilingual is like a threat to that very tenuous masculinity, especially if you're powerless. The more powerless you are, the more you want to keep that.
Does it have to do with like a strong sense of German identity?
Well, no, they don't have any German identity, they're the Hungarians. So,
I was confused about
do
that.
they have, so let's translate your question, does it have to do with a strong sense of Hungarian identity? To some degree it might, and